She stood in the airport, cold metal cuffs tightening around her wrists. "Fake ID," the cop sneered, waving her military badge. But before he could snap the cuffs shut, a security officer straightened and saluted. Then another, and another. The cop's smirk vanished. What happened next shocked everyone. Let's start from the beginning. Kennedy Wells had spent years perfecting the art of patience. Long deployments, grueling training, and the rigid structure of military life had conditioned her to endure discomfort, scrutiny, and pressure without flinching. But as she stood in the security line at Atlanta International Airport, the weight of exhaustion settled deep in her bones. She was finally going home. The thought of stepping off the plane and seeing her family again had kept her moving through the past few months, and now, after countless days overseas, she was just one flight away from where she belonged. She adjusted the strap of her duffel bag and exhaled slowly, focusing on the hum of the terminal. The airport was its usual chaotic mess. Business travelers tapping away at their laptops, families herding restless children, tourists staring at departure boards with mild confusion. She had been through this routine more times than she could count. It should have been simple. Show her ticket, present her ID, pass through security, and wait for her boarding call. But as she reached the checkpoint, she felt it before she saw it. The weight of a gaze lingering too long. Sergeant Paul Grayson, a thick-set man in his 40s with a rigid posture and the unmistakable air of someone who relished his authority, was staring directly at her. His expression wasn't the usual detached focus of an officer scanning the crowd. It was something else, something calculating. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside for a random search," he said, his voice clipped. Kennedy's fingers instinctively curled into her palms. Here we go. She had been through extra screenings before. Random checks, prolonged ID verifications, additional bag searches. Sometimes it was routine. Other times, it was something more insidious. She wanted to believe this was just protocol, but the way Grayson was looking at her, the way his eyes flicked over her face, over her skin, over the way she carried herself, it told her everything she needed to know. Still, she complied. Because that's what you did. You complied, you didn't cause a scene, and you got through it. She stepped to the side as directed. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 20. Other travelers who had been pulled aside were quickly cleared and sent on their way. But Kennedy? She was still standing there, watching as Grayson moved with infuriating leisure, taking his time inspecting her military ID like it was a novelty item. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 30 minutes. "This is excessive," she finally said, her voice controlled but firm. "I have a flight to catch." Grayson didn't even look up. Instead, he smirked, like he had been waiting for her to speak up. "People with fake IDs always seem to be in a hurry," he said. Kennedy's chest tightened. Did he just... Her body tensed instinctively. A sharp electric pulse of anger burned at the edges of her composure, but she forced herself to take a slow breath. "Excuse me?" Grayson finally met her gaze, and what she saw there wasn't suspicion. It was certainty. He had already made up his mind about her. "Your ID looks forged," he said smoothly, holding up the laminated card between his fingers, tilting it under the harsh airport lighting as if it would suddenly reveal hidden secrets. "I've seen a lot of these." Kennedy didn't move, didn't blink. If she had learned anything from years of being in uniform, it was that losing your temper in situations like this only made things worse. She inhaled slowly, keeping her tone even. "Do not give him the reaction he wants." "That's mine," she said. "I'm an officer in the United States Air Force." Grayson let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, really?" He tilted his head slightly, eyes dragging over her civilian clothes, jeans, a fitted jacket, sneakers. "You don't look like a soldier." And there it was, not even subtle, not even an attempt to disguise what he meant. Kennedy's nails dug into her palms. She had heard this before, in different words, different tones, but always the same meaning. You don't fit the image in my head. You don't belong. Her voice remained level, but her patience was wearing razor thin. What does a soldier look like to you, Sergeant? Grayson leaned forward just slightly, just enough to make it clear that this wasn't about rules or protocols anymore. This was about control. They're usually not so defensive, he said with a smirk. Kennedy's pulse drummed against her temples. She thought of the nights spent in a foreign desert, training missions in sweltering heat, the weight of a flight helmet pressing against her temples. She thought of the countless hours, the sacrifices, the unwavering discipline that had earned her rank. And now here she was, treated like a criminal in her own country, by someone who probably never stepped foot in a war zone. She exhaled, forcing herself to remain still, forcing herself to swallow the fire in her throat. "What exactly is the issue, Sergeant?" she asked. Grayson tapped her ID against his palm. "Like I said, this doesn't look real." Kennedy clenched her jaw. "Then scan it." "I will, when I get around to it." She felt the eyes of the other passengers on her. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others watched with wide, wary expressions like they knew exactly what was happening but were too afraid to say anything. Kennedy's stomach churned. She could feel it building, the slow, insidious humiliation of being singled out, the creeping realization that this wasn't about security. This was personal. She had a choice. She could stay silent and let him drag this out for as long as he wanted, or she could push back and risk making things worse. She straightened her shoulders. "You're holding me here for no reason," she said, her voice sharp now, controlled but unyielding. "Either scan my ID or call your supervisor." Grayson's smirk flickered, just for a second. He didn't like that. "I am the supervisor," he said, gripping her ID tighter. Her jaw locked, and then, before she could respond, he took a step closer. "Problem, Captain?" he said, the title dripping with mockery. Kennedy forced herself to hold his gaze. "This isn't over." Grayson gestured to his radio, his smirk widening. "We're going to have to take you in for questioning." Kennedy's heart slammed against her ribs. A cold, humiliating dread settled in her stomach as she felt dozens of eyes fix on her. Whispers spread like wildfire through the terminal. The scene unfolding was loud, public, deliberate. He wanted this, wanted the spectacle, wanted her to crumble under the weight of it. But Kennedy Wells had been trained to withstand far worse than a bully in uniform. "Call your supervisor," she said, her voice measured, even. Grayson scoffed. "I am the supervisor." His fingers clamped around her arm, tight, possessive, like he had already decided that she belonged in cuffs. Kennedy yanked herself free. "You have no right to detain me." The air in the terminal grew thick. People slowed their steps, hesitating, watching. Grayson's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before his features twisted into something colder. "Resisting, huh?" He clucked his tongue. "That's an arrestable offense." And then, with an ease that sent a bolt of rage through Kennedy's chest, he pulled out his handcuffs. The unmistakable click of metal snapping open sent a ripple of tension through the bystanders. The world shrank down to the steel glint of the cuffs, to the way Grayson was enjoying this, how his grip tightened ever so slightly, his stance shifting into something predatory. Kennedy clenched her fists, her breath steady, controlled. If she let this escalate, if she reacted the way he wanted her to, she knew exactly how this would end. And then, a sharp, commanding voice cut through the air. "What's going on?" The tension snapped like a rubber band. A security officer approached, her dark brown eyes narrowed, assessing the situation with careful, deliberate calculation. Her uniform was crisp, her posture rigid with authority. Officer Diaz, a nameplate on her chest. Strong, composed, unshaken. Grayson barely spared her a glance, his grip on Kennedy's wrist firm. "Fake military ID," he said smugly, as if the words themselves were enough to justify everything. Diaz's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze. A subtle shift, too quick for anyone but Kennedy to catch. "Let me see it," Diaz said. Grayson hesitated, just for a second, a crack in his confidence. Then, with a huff, he shoved the ID into Diaz's hand. She took it, turning it over carefully, her eyes scanning every detail. The weight of silence pressed against Kennedy's ribs as Diaz studied the card, flipping it once, then twice, testing the texture, the markings, the seal. Then she looked up. "Captain Kennedy Wells?" Kennedy exhaled slowly, her shoulders squaring as she met Diaz's gaze. "Yes." And in that moment, everything changed. Diaz's demeanor shifted instantly. The rigid professionalism in her stance melted into something sharper, more intentional. The calculation in her expression hardened into certainty. "Your Air Force?" Diaz asked. Kennedy gave a single, firm nod. And then, without hesitation, Diaz snapped to attention and saluted. The terminal fell into utter, stunned silence. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Even the low murmur of the crowd seemed to evaporate. Then it happened again. A second security officer, standing just a few feet away, recognized the name. His back straightened, his eyes widened, and without missing a beat, he saluted too. Grayson stiffened. His smirk was gone, replaced by something much uglier. Kennedy could feel the shift happening in real time, the balance of power tilting beneath his feet. More officers took notice. More heads turned. The tension in the air changed, became something electric, something charged. And then, like a tide rolling in, it kept spreading. A third salute, then a fourth. And suddenly, Grayson wasn't in control anymore. The world was watching. The right people were watching. Kennedy didn't move. She didn't need to. She just waited. Waited for the moment Grayson would realize that this wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just the usual hush of an airport terminal between announcements. It was a weight, a vacuum that swallowed every murmur, every footstep, every breath. It was the kind of silence that came when something irrevocable had just happened, when the balance of power shifted so suddenly, so undeniably, that even those who weren't directly involved could feel it in their bones. Grayson's face paled. He looked from Kennedy to Diaz, his confidence flickering, cracking. "This a joke?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Diaz didn't move, didn't lower her hand. Her posture remained rigid, her salute sharp, unwavering, carved from something unshakable. "Captain Wells," she said, her voice clear, commanding. "I apologize for this disrespect." Her words rang through the terminal like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. A ruling, a verdict, and then it spread. More airport security officers arrived, their uniforms crisp, their expressions shifting the moment they saw the scene before them. Some recognized Kennedy's name. Others only needed to see one of their own saluting to understand that something had gone horribly, irreparably wrong. One by one they followed Diaz's lead. Another salute, then another, and another. Perfect formation. The air shifted again, heavier now, but not with oppression, with gravity. Grayson's grip on Kennedy's wrist slackened. He wasn't in control anymore. The realization dawned on his face, slow, reluctant. He had started this situation with absolute authority, standing tall, smug, assured in his power. But now, he was shrinking, the weight of his mistake sinking into his shoulders, into the tightness around his mouth, into the stiffness of his stance. Kennedy stepped forward. She didn't snatch her ID back. She didn't have to. The way she moved, the way she stood, made it clear that she had already taken back control. "You accused me of being a fraud," she said. Her voice wasn't raised, wasn't sharp. It didn't need to be. The sheer force of the truth in her words carried more weight than any volume could. "And now you're realizing just how wrong you were." A murmur rippled through the airport staff, a low tide of agreement, of quiet indignation, of people shifting, glancing at one another with expressions that were no longer neutral. Grayson took a step back, instinct, as if trying to create distance from the situation, from the weight of his own actions. I was just doing my job." Diaz's eyes locked onto his, unyielding. "No," she said. No hesitation, no softness. "You were profiling, and you just tried to arrest an Air Force hero." The words hit like a hammer. Kennedy saw it then, the fracture, the way Grayson's throat bobbed as he swallowed, the sudden tightness in his jaw, the tension coiling in his hands as they clenched into fists at his sides. He knew. He knew. The airport onlookers had seen everything. Someone pulled out their phone, then another, and another, the slow whir of a camera lens extending, a red recording light blinking in the corner of her vision. There would be no rewriting this moment, no convenient narrative shift, no way to twist the story into something else. The truth was being captured. The truth was going to spread. Another murmur rolled through the crowd, thicker now, louder. Not quite outrage, not yet, but something close. A building storm. Grayson's fingers twitched. His breath came too fast, too uneven. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being the one under scrutiny. "Should I call the police?" a security officer asked. Kennedy shook her head. She didn't need to. He would deal with the consequences soon enough. Within hours, the footage spread like wildfire. It started with a few retweets, a couple of shares, just another moment of injustice captured on camera, another instance of someone in power abusing their authority. But then something shifted. The sheer weight of what had unfolded, the undeniable clarity of the video, struck a chord deeper than anyone could have anticipated. By the next morning, the hashtag #HabSaluteHer had taken over social media. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, news outlets, talk shows. It was everywhere. The clip played over and over. Grayson's smug expression, the tightening grip on his cuffs, the moment Diaz stepped in. The instant the first salute snapped into place, then another, and another. People watched, again and again, unable to look away. The injustice, the shift in power, the sheer weight of the moment when Kennedy stood her ground, when the tides turned, when an entire terminal bore witness to the truth. And then, as the internet does, it dug deeper. Within hours, the Air Force confirmed Kennedy Wells' identity, her rank, her years of service, her commendations. That was the moment it stopped being just another viral incident. That was the moment it became a movement. The backlash was swift. Grayson was placed on immediate suspension. The airport scrambled to do damage control, issuing a formal apology that read more like a desperate attempt to stem the PR disaster. But it wasn't enough. The military released a statement condemning the incident, standing firmly behind Kennedy. The Air Force praised her professionalism and restraint. Veterans rallied behind her. And then, the real wave hit. Thousands of black veterans, men and women who had served their country, fought for it, bled for it, began sharing their own stories. Stories of being stopped at airports, of having their military service questioned, of standing in uniform and still being asked for proof, of being treated as frauds in their own country. The stories poured in, each one amplifying the last, each one adding to the fire. For the first time, the world wasn't just watching. It was listening. Days later, Kennedy sat in her living room, phone buzzing non-stop on the coffee table. Calls, messages, interview requests. She hadn't responded to most of them. She didn't want the attention. She hadn't done anything heroic. She had simply existed, and for that, she had almost been arrested. But then a new notification flashed across the screen. A direct message. From the President of the United States. She stared at it for a long moment before opening it. The message was brief, but undeniably personal. Captain Wells, your service to this country is not just in the missions you've flown, but in the strength you showed that day. On behalf of this nation, thank you. She exhaled slowly, gripping the phone a little tighter. It wasn't about one message. It wasn't even about her. It was about what this moment had uncovered, what it had forced the world to see. A week later, Kennedy was at the airport again. Same terminal, same security lines, same procedures, but this time everything was different. She stepped into the terminal, her duffel slung over her shoulder, heart steady but expectant. And then, it happened. It started with just one. A single security officer at the far end of the terminal, standing at attention, saluting, then another, and another. And suddenly, it was all of them. Every security officer in sight, men, women, young, old, snapping to attention in perfect unison, saluting her. Kennedy froze. A lump formed in her throat, hot and unexpected. The weight of everything, hit her all at once. Not just that moment at the airport, not just Grayson's hand tightening around her wrist. Not just the violation, the humiliation, the rage she had swallowed down. It was the years before that. The countless moments that had come before. The ones that had never gone viral. The ones no one had filmed. All the times she had been looked at and doubted. All the times she had been lessened. All the times people had seen her uniform but not her. And now, this, the honor, the respect, the acknowledgement. Her vision blurred. She lifted her hand, and this time, she saluted back.